From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Monday, December 15th, 2014. Juan Cole, history professor at the University of Michigan and author of The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East, will join us live in studio to discuss ISIS, the CIA torture report, and much more. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, a number of people were being held hostage in a chocolate shop in Sydney, Australia since last night. With little real information to go on, all that is known is that a black flag with white Arabic writing was held up in the shop window by hostages, suggesting the action had a political goal, possibly related to the Islamic State. Media have released the name of an Iranian-born person they believe to be the armed gunman keeping people hostage, Haron Moniz. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, another situation also involving guns is unfolding. A man believed to be a military veteran early this morning killed at least 5 people in 3 separate incidents in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. He is still at large. Rahul, it's interesting to see how different the media coverage of these 2 separate incidents involving guns is. One so much more high profile than the other, with the word terrorist already appearing in connection to it. I know both stories are in the very early stages of unfolding, and we're seeing right now that the cafe in Sydney was just stormed by police and hostages released. But do you have any thoughts on how we as a society view these 2 types of incidents?
Well, I don't know what to make of the Pennsylvania incident yet, what category to put it in, but if we were to assume that it's like one of the many that we've seen that is motivated in some way by extreme right-wing ideology, then I think both of these incidents would then be in a category that I find quite terrifying. I think that both the sort of the general kinds of actions that are being done by people in Western countries in response to the existence of ISIS and its propaganda, and those that are happening primarily in the United States in response to the propaganda of the extreme right wing, are extremely dangerous as trends. And if anything, it would be that second category that seems to be more likely a source of incidents in the United States. But as I said, it's really too early to tell what's going on in Pennsylvania.
And we'll certainly follow up on these stories in the coming days. The United Nations' latest climate summit in Peru, Lima, has just wrapped up. And as expected, the news is grim. Delegates to the COP20 climate talks were charged with laying the groundwork for a summit in Paris next year. But the agreement they came to was so weak that climate justice activists are calling it a, quote, roadmap to global burning. One environmentalist complained that it is taking us backwards, while another declared that it has set the Earth for an average warming of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. Scientists have estimated that the planet can take no more than a 2-degree warming to stave off catastrophic impacts. Now, Rahul, some people hope that the announced U.S.-China agreement to lower emissions and a U.S. pledge to fund the Green Climate Fund in the days leading up to the conference meant that the Lima negotiations might yield better results this time around. Are you surprised at all?
I'm not, actually. The thing that surprised me was the U.S.-China agreement in the first place. And what would surprise me even more is if the two countries actually live up to the commitments they made in that agreement. At this point, I really have stopped expecting to see any progress made at international summits about the climate. So, yes, I mean, let's just remember that what's put us on the track to 3, 4 or more degrees of warming is the industrial economy we've created and the lack of will of any politicians to do anything about it, not so much just the failures of this or that conference.
And finally, thousands of people marched in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, demanding an end to police violence aimed at communities of color. The march, headed by Al Sharpton's National Action Network, included a rally featuring the parents of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, John Crawford III, Tamir Rice, and Amadou Diallo, among others. None of the anti-police brutality youth activists who have been tirelessly organizing in Ferguson, Missouri, were asked to speak on stage, however, leading to a small group to briefly commandeer the microphone. On the same day as the march, St. Louis County prosecutor Robert McCullough quietly released a third trove of grand jury evidence related to the shooting death of Michael Brown. The documents, which McCulloch says were, quote, inadvertently kept from the public in the initial release, included audio of the gunshots and testimony from Dorian Johnson, Brown's companion during the incident. Rahul, what do you make of this sort of ongoing clash between authorities who seem bent on protecting police and this new movement that seems to have emerged?
Well, you know, the Memphis garbage workers strike that was Martin Luther King's last activist stop, as it were, has gone down in history in part because of, if you see footage from it, the people on strike are carrying signs that say, "I am a man." And that resonates because, of course, it was a protest against a system that denied the humanity of black men and black women, of course, and denied their equality. Right now, I think we've had slogans like Black Lives Matter and, of course, the proliferating "I Can't Breathe" are going to be, for this generation, what "I Am a Man" was for a previous generation. I think that there will be ebbs and flows of the protest against police brutality and impunity, but it's not going to go away.
Rahul, thanks so much as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. This is Uprising. We'll be right back in studio with Juan Cole. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali. Professor John Yoo, famous for authorizing what became known as the Bush-era torture memos, says even he can't get behind the CIA's definition of enhanced interrogation methods. In the 500-plus page release of a Senate Intelligence Committee report on the CIA's treatment of prisoners during the post-9/11 years, horrific practices such as rectal feedings, John Yoo said on CNN, quote, "If these things happened as they're described in the report, they were not supposed to be done, and the people who did those are at risk legally because they were acting outside their orders." Yoo seems to be distancing himself from former Vice President Dick Cheney, who has unabashedly made the rounds of news media defending the CIA's barbarism and even invoking Yoo's legal memos to justify the abuse. Today, in the wake of this explosive report and the conversation it is once more generating about our national morals, we turn to Juan Cole, who is the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. He's written extensively on modern Islamic movements in Egypt, the Persian Gulf, and in South Asia. He's lived in various parts of the Muslim world for nearly 10 years and continues to travel widely there. He speaks Arabic, Farsi, and Urdu. His books include Engaging the Muslim World, Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East, and his most recent called The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. Since 2002, he's published the blog Informed Comment at juancole.com. He also writes for truthdig.com. In fact, Juan is in LA, where this program is produced, to speak at an event called Monsters of Our Own Creation, America's Role in the Middle East, this Thursday, December 18th at 6:30 p.m. at the Santa Monica Bay Women's Club, 1210 4th Street in Santa Monica. I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Juan Cole.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, I've read your work for many years, and I'm so excited that you're here and able to speak with us at this very moment in time when this report has come out. And just this morning, we had the story of this unfolding hostage crisis in Sydney that may be linked to the Islamic State because of its iconic black flag with white lettering that was seen in the window of the store where people were taken hostage. Now, when ordinary people try to make sense of such an incident, all they see is this this barbarism, they see this insanity, they must hate us for our values, quote unquote. How do you explain what seems to be a sort of persistent support of groups like the Islamic State among people all over the world? How do you explain that to ordinary people?
Well, there isn't actually much support for this group, and every community has its extremists. There are a certain number of white Americans who are really into neo-Nazism and white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, back in the 20s, the Ku Klux Klan actually took over the state of Indiana. It's not.
And that didn't come to define the entire country necessarily.
White people don't get tagged in the same way that minorities get tagged by the most extreme elements in their midst. With regard to what happened in Australia, this guy's just a whack job. He's actually an Iranian Shiite.
Right, and this Islamic State is a Sunni group.
Kills Shiites, and this guy, put himself out as some kind of mystical healer. He's been charged with accessory to various crimes. He's just a disturbed individual, and announced a month ago that he'd gone over to the hardline Sunni Salafi form and was now a Muslim and so forth. This is not. You can't read off anything from this guy. He's just a disturbed individual, and he's not even a member of the mainstream Sunni community in Australia, and the Sydney people actually have been very good about promising that there won't be reprisal actions taken.
So when President Obama and other U.S. officials speak about the Islamic State, they often invoke this idea that there are thousands of foreign fighters from around the world, including the U.S. and Europe, that are traveling to Syria and northern Iraq to join in the fight with ISIS. Are those reports even true? Do we know they're true?
Well, yes, but they don't amount to anything. David Cameron keeps giving speeches. He talks about 400 British youth going off to fight with I call them Daesh, which is what they call them in Arabic.
It's the Arabic acronym of ISIS.
And they don't like it, so it's much better to call him.
And Secretary Kerry has been referring to them as such as well.
That's right. There's nothing Islamic about them. They're just criminals. They're gangsters. They're smugglers, human traffickers, and these youth who went off from England, there are nearly 4 million British Muslims. Their numbers have doubled in the past 15 years. 400 is not actually significant. You could get 400 people to do anything. There was a cult here in Southern California where the leader of it got, I think, over 40 people to commit suicide in order to catch a ride on an asteroid. So, Cameron is simply hyping this thing, and the reason for that is that he's competing with the far right in the UK and making hay. So no, this group in the desert fringes of Syria is not important, and it's not a huge big thing that it's been hyped to be. There's a whole class of national security experts in Washington, D.C. who make their living identifying threats to the homeland and then putting themselves forward as the solution. In fact, this group is very unlikely to be there in a few years. It's not popular. The opinion polling, it took over the city of Mosul, which is in Iraq. It's 2 million people there. They're cosmopolitan people. They were asked in 2012 by pollsters that, do you believe in separation of religion and state? 75% of them said yes. They're the most secular people
So
in the
how did
Middle East.
ISIS take over such a city? And that's the fear that has been ignited, that this small group of ragtag soldiers caught everybody off guard.
Yeah, well, they didn't conquer the city. There was an uprising in the city in conjunction with them against the Iraqi government, which the U.S. installed, and which is hardline Shiite, and which people felt was oppressive.
So what you're saying is that rather than see this as a success of ISIS, it should be seen as a failure of U.S. policy.
Complete failure of U.S. policy. The U.S. created enormous power vacuums in that part of the world, and also set up very unfair and invidious forms of governance, which people felt were oppressive. And when people feel oppressed, they make deals with the devil.
So let's talk about the CIA report, the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on CIA torture tactics in the years following 9/11. The CIA and Pentagon used this fear that it would ignite more anger in the Muslim world, more attacks against Americans to try to squash the report. First of all, if they were so worried about it, why did they torture? And second of all, didn't the Muslim world already know about CIA torture? They didn't really need this report to tell them something they already knew, didn't they?
Oh, well, there was no reaction in the Muslim world to that report. That was just American inside the Beltway politics. You know, if the Republican Party was afraid that this would stick to them, and so they sat in a room and said, well, what counter-narrative could we put out there? And they decided, oh, well, Democrats endangering national security by making crazy Muslims angry. And in fact, there's no, you know, Friday would have been when there were big demonstrations in the Middle East. That's when the demonstrations happened. There were none, absolutely. There was nothing in the Arabic press, in Cairo, in any major Arab city. There was nothing. It was a complete non-story in the Middle East. So all of this hype, and I watched TV and cable news and on CNN, there were these banners, and Wolf Blitzer was pushing this thing all week that, oh, what will be the reaction in the Middle East? It was a non-story. No.
And why? Why was there not much reaction?
Well, first of all, it's a 450-page report in English about Americans agonizing over their own brutality. So how is that relevant to anybody in the Middle East? And as you know, the people who might be angry that Al-Qaeda was tortured are Al-Qaeda, who want to do things to the United States anyway. It's not like they need more justification, and nobody likes them in the Middle East.
But there were innocent people as well, people who were picked up, who were tortured, who were not supposed to even be tortured. The CIA mistook some sources for terror suspects.
The United States held 25,000 prisoners in Iraq.
Yeah.
And very large numbers of them just happened to be in the area where an incident took place, and they were just rounded up by the GIs. They didn't know Arabic. They didn't know who these guys are. It was just youth.
Are you shocked that there isn't more widespread outrage at the U.S.?
Well, you know, people were very upset about the invasion and occupation of Iraq, and that did produce large demonstrations, which were not covered. I mean, there were 100,000 people demonstrating in Cairo in the spring of 2003. It wasn't on U.S. TV. So they don't, when they really do get upset about something, the West doesn't cover it, and the things that they're not upset about, they hype. It's a very bizarro world.
So just focusing for a moment on Americans agonizing over what Americans did, as you put it, do you see a sort of blame game being carried out between people like John Yoo and Dick Cheney? You saying that the torture went further than his memos laid out, and Cheney saying that the torture memos written by you gave them the legal authority. I mean, is there any fear that there might be some accountability, any prosecution fears?
Oh, well, I think very clearly that Yoo is backtracking because he's in some kind of legal jeopardy, and I think, as you know, whether he can be a professor at a university, if this is the kind of thing he authorized, is a big question, and indeed, if this is the kind of thing he authorized, he could, you know, be open to prosecution, especially in other countries, and so he's trying to allege that he didn't intend to actually authorized the things that he authorized. But it was clear that the CIA was shopping. The Human Rights Watch has said this, that they would go to people like you and say, can we engage in enhanced interrogation? And they would say, well, as long as you don't put somebody's life in danger, you can pretty much do anything to them, as long as you don't actually, you know, get them to the brink of being killed.
A permanent organ failure or damage,
and things like
right?
that. And so then the CIA would use those. They went shopping for definitions that were made possible for them to do everything but actually kill somebody or deeply endanger their lives. But that's not the definition of torture. Torture is inflicting extreme, cruel and pain on someone.
Even if it doesn't leave a mark.
Even if it doesn't leave a mark. Well, there are lots of forms of torture that don't leave a mark, and which are recognized in, I mean, they're international law. There's a convention against torture, which Ronald Reagan signed the great hero of the right, which defines torture, and what the CIA did falls into that convention. It was illegal in U.S. law because we signed the treaty.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and whether Congress follows up on this report, because the release of the report isn't an end of itself, or it's not supposed to be.
Sonali, Congress following up was the phrase that you used. That's very unlikely.
Yes. So what about this? This strange other thing that we saw playing out, which is the Obama administration fighting with members of its own party to keep the report secret. Is the Obama administration, and this is a question that does need to be asked, trying to hide something about its own conduct? Obama's been president for 6 years now.
Yeah, I actually can't see evidence that Obama was opposed to the release of the report. I think John Kerry called Senator Feinstein and asked her to delay a week. And I think it's because there was some threat going on in the Middle East. Remember, the embassies in Cairo were closed and so forth. So I think it was tactical. But Obama he was the first one to come out and say...
So those reports were exaggerated, that he
oh, yeah.
tried to...
No, I think he wanted it out. He called it torture. And actually this was significant because no one had called it torture who was high in the government until Obama did. Once you do that, you do open the CIA personnel involved to potential prosecution. So Obama was under enormous pressure not to use that word, right. And he did anyway.
Right. Juan Cole, you said that when the Arab world does rise up legitimately and en masse with popular resistance movements, the U.S. media tends to ignore it. And you've written a book about Arab millennials, and I'm wondering what you make of this very sad turn the Egyptian revolution seems to have taken, with the most recent news being Hosni Mubarak's, the decision by a court to essentially acquit him of all charges. The charges to begin with were based on the killings of just a few hundred people and then some other corruption charges. He may walk free. And what does that say about the struggles of a country like Egypt, where you have a narrative that defies the standard mainstream U.S. media narrative of how Arabs might want to see their future?
Well, the big story in the Middle East was that these dictatorships were crony capitalist regimes, and they were planning to set things up so as to pass power on to the families in the next generation. They were kind of become like mafia families, and so the president's son was going to become the president. This actually happened in Syria, but it was going to happen in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia and so forth, and Yemen. And the youth who were born in the 80s and 90s just found this completely unacceptable, that they would be inherited like so many sticks of furniture, and that these corrupt regimes which blocked other people, you know, if you were a successful entrepreneur, they would come and say, you have a nice store here, it would be too bad if something happened to it, and threaten you and make you sell it to them. So they were actually blocking the economic progress of the country. They were extremely corrupt. And the youth just said this is unacceptable. And they overthrew 4 presidents for life, and they initiated vast social changes. And I think it's way too early to make a pronouncement on where all this is going. We're only 3 years into it. At this point in the American Revolution, the British still held Staten Island. And in the French Revolution, the king hadn't quite been executed yet. So it's very early days. And I think what's happened is that this generation has put down a marker that business as usual, this sort of seedy, corrupt dictatorships, family rule, and so forth, is not acceptable to them. So even in Egypt, where there has been a kind of thermidor, a turn to the right, General Sisi, who ran for president and is now president, is operating under a constitution that limits him to 2 terms.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if he does respect that.
I really don't think the Egyptian people will put up with any more presidents for life. I think there's been a real sea change. And although there's a lot of repression in Egypt now on journalists and non-governmental organizations and so forth, the Egyptians are still very feisty. They demonstrate, they defy the government. And I was there in March. There were enormous labor strikes going on, which the government was clearly afraid to do anything drastic about, including the postal workers, which kind of paralyzes the economy. And the government gave in to them and gave them raises and things. So people are not quiescent in places like Egypt. And in Tunisia, you've had a relatively successful democratic transition. You've had two elections in a row. People agree on the rules of the game. The losers go home. And the most recent elections in Tunisia brought a secular party to power after an interlude in which the Muslim fundamentalists were in.
But then there's Libya.
Well, revolutions are messy. I think.
And Libya was the one case where the U.S. and NATO had a very overt interference, the results of which may be partly to blame for what we're seeing today.
Well, when a country goes into revolution like Libya did, and the same thing happened in Syria, if the government digs in its heels and deploys, tanks and artillery against civilians, it militarizes the struggle. That's what happened in Libya. Once you have militias, they're very hard to demobilize. So I think it's just the revolution destabilizes things, and you've got a lot of militiamen who are heavily armed. But again, these things don't necessarily work out easily. In the French Revolution, people forget now, there was a peasant revolt in the Vendée in which we think 40 to 100,000 people were killed in the course of the 1790s. And people asked Thomas Jefferson whether it was worth it, and he said yes at the time. So, I think we're a little bit spoiled or something when we look at these massive political events, that we expect a revolution to suddenly result in positive changes. There's a lot of things that have to be worked through in these countries before things settle down.
Briefly, there's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which many see as sort of defining issue in the Middle East. Tensions rising there once more after the war in Gaza, with East Jerusalem, the mosque, and in the West Bank, major protests. The death this past week of a minister that Palestinians say was the result of Israeli aggression. Do you see, and some people fear a third intifada, I've said this several times on the show, do you see that region on the verge of exploding again?
Well, it's not going anyplace good, and there's potential eventually for severe violence in the West Bank. You could have another 1947 there. And geopolitically, it's a flashpoint, and it's all the fault of the United States. If all the U.S. would have to do is simply not veto UN security resolutions regarding Israel and let the world put sanctions on Israel for crimes against humanity and illegal actions, and then the thing would get solved.
Well, Juan, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck at the event this Thursday. My guest, Juan Cole, is a professor at the University of Michigan. He's going to be speaking at a Truth Dig event called Monsters of Our Own Creation, America's Role in the Middle East, on Thursday, December 18th, 6 p.m., Santa Monica Bay Women's Club, 1210 4th Street in Santa Monica. You can check truthdig.com for more information. Thank you so much, Juan.
Thank you, Sonali.
This is Uprising. We'll be right back.